Welcome to Warfare Codex. If you enjoy fascinating and unusual history, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible stories. Now, let's dive into the strange and extraordinary world of history's most unique individuals. 1. Battle of the Oaken Bucket, 1325. Modena versus Bologna, Italy. This battle began over one of the most absurd reasons in history: a wooden bucket. In the 14th century, city-states in Italy were constantly at odds. The rivalry between Modena and Bologna was one of them. According to legend, Modenan soldiers raided Bologna and stole a sacred wooden bucket that carried holy water. Bologna saw this as a huge insult and declared war to get the bucket back. Bologna's army set out with 30,000 men, while Modena responded with only 7,000 disciplined soldiers. In the Battle of Zappolino, Modena decisively defeated Bologna. As a result, Modena never returned the bucket, and today, the famous bucket is still displayed in Modena. 2. The Emu War, 1932. Australian government versus emu birds, Australia. In 1932, the Australian government went to war against emu birds that were destroying crops. This war began as a military operation, with the army deploying soldiers equipped with machine guns to shoot the emus. However, the emus were fast and agile, making it nearly impossible for the soldiers to hit them. The operation ended in disaster as the birds outsmarted the military, and the Emu War went down as one of the greatest military failures in history, with the emus emerging victorious. 3. The Battle of Caransebes, 1788. Austrian Empire versus Austrian Empire, Austria. The Battle of Caransebes is one of the strangest battles in history because it was fought between members of the same army. The Austrian Empire was preparing for a campaign against the Ottoman Empire. However, during the preparations, a misunderstanding led Austrian soldiers to fire upon each other, thinking they were under attack from the enemy. This escalated into a chaotic conflict, resulting in the deaths of over 10,000 Austrian soldiers. The Ottomans did not even have to engage, and the battle is remembered as one of the most disastrous and confusing military events in history. 4. The War of the Whiskers, 1740. Prussia versus Austria, Europe. The War of the Whiskers began over a dispute about the length of a general's beard. Prussian King Frederick II initiated a war with Austria, accusing the Austrian generals of being undisciplined because their beards were too long. This led to small-scale skirmishes between the two powers, though it was less about military strategy and more about a personal grievance over facial hair. Despite the absurd cause, the war occurred, though it had little lasting impact. 5. The Football War, 1969. El Salvador versus Honduras, Central America. The Football War was triggered by a series of football matches between El Salvador and Honduras in 1969, as both countries were competing for a spot in the 1970 FIFA World Cup. The tension from the matches escalated into violent clashes between the two nations. After the games, political issues and tensions boiled over, leading to a full-scale war between the two countries. The war lasted for 4 days, with nearly 2,000 casualties, before an international ceasefire was brokered. 6. The Great Guitar War, 1914. United States, Europe. The Great Guitar War was a bizarre trade war between guitar manufacturers in the early 20th century. Guitar producers in the US and Europe were involved in legal battles over unfair competition and intellectual property theft. Allegations of imitation and poor quality products led to an all-out legal war, but the conflict never escalated into a physical confrontation. Instead, it was resolved in the courts, with various settlements and rulings made on who owned the rights to different guitar designs. 7. The Dog War, 1850. Native American tribes versus U.S. government. United States. The Dog War, which occurred in 1850s America, was sparked by disputes over dogs between different Native American tribes. The conflict was initially about sharing livestock and hunting resources, but eventually escalated when one tribe's dogs attacked another's livestock. This led to a violent dispute between the tribes, and the U.S. government intervened to try to stop the violence. While the war was small in scale, it highlighted the tensions between indigenous tribes and the growing U.S. presence in the region. 8. The Battle of the Devil's Bridge, 1499. Switzerland. Switzerland. In 1499, the Swiss Confederacy fought a battle over control of a bridge in the region. The bridge, known as the Devil's Bridge, was tied to local superstitions, and it was believed to be under the influence of dark forces. The Swiss forces fought for control of the bridge, and the battle itself became symbolic of the mystical and religious tensions in the region. The conflict, while relatively minor, remains an example of how local superstitions and beliefs can sometimes fuel wars. 9. The Chicken War, 1719. France versus Spain, France. The Chicken War took place in 1719 between French and Spanish settlers. It all started over a dispute about the ownership of chickens in certain border towns. This minor issue snowballed into an armed conflict over territory and resources. The war, while small and seemingly insignificant, led to several border skirmishes, but it never escalated to the level of full-scale war. The Chicken War remains one of the oddest causes of military conflict in history. 10. The Great Strawberry War, 1852, France. The Great Strawberry War was a minor conflict in France that erupted over stolen strawberries. In 1852, a French farmer accused his neighbor of stealing strawberries from his farm. The disagreement escalated into a violent altercation, and soon other farmers became involved in the dispute. What started as a simple theft accusation turned into a small but fierce battle between local communities, illustrating how seemingly trivial issues can sometimes spiral into larger conflicts. 11. The War of the Bavarian Succession, 1778 to 1779. Austria versus Prussia, Europe. This war broke out over the succession to the Duchy of Bavaria. After the death of the Bavarian elector Maximilian Joseph, who had no direct heirs, both Austria and Prussia sought to claim the duchy. Austria, led by Maria Theresa, and Prussia, under Frederick the Great, clashed over territorial control. The war lasted for a mere 8 months and resulted in no major battles. Ultimately, it ended with Austria retaining most of Bavaria, but both sides incurred significant losses for very little territorial gain. 12. The War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739 to 1748. Britain versus Spain, the Caribbean. The War of Jenkins's Ear was named after an incident in which a British captain, Robert Jenkins, had his ear cut off by a Spanish official while he was on a ship in the Caribbean. This event, exaggerated and used as a rallying cry, led to a conflict between Britain and Spain. The war mainly involved naval skirmishes, with Britain seeking to secure its trade routes and Spain attempting to suppress British piracy. Despite the war lasting nearly a decade, it was largely inconclusive and resulted in minimal territorial changes. 13. The Pig War, 1859. United States versus Great Britain, San Juan Islands. In 1859, tensions between the United States and Great Britain nearly led to war over a dead pig. The pig, belonging to a British settler, was shot by an American farmer after it destroyed his crops on the San Juan Islands, which were disputed between the two countries. The incident escalated into a standoff between U.S. and British forces, though no shots were fired. After several months of tension, the dispute was resolved peacefully, and both sides agreed to allow arbitration by a third party. 14. The Battle of the Hill of Crosses, 1831, Poland versus Russia, Lithuania. In 1831, the Polish-Lithuanian region was caught in the midst of an uprising against Russian imperial forces. The Battle of the Hill of Crosses took place over a disputed hill, which was believed to have spiritual significance for the local people. This small yet fierce battle broke out when Russian soldiers tried to seize control of the hill, which had been the site of several crosses erected by local peasants as symbols of resistance. The Polish fighters, alongside local peasants, launched a desperate defense to protect their sacred ground. Though it was not a major conflict, it was a bizarre and symbolic moment in the larger Polish resistance against Russian rule. Eventually, the hill was taken by the Russians, but it remained a symbol of Polish defiance. 15. The War of the Stray Dog, 1925. Greece versus Bulgaria, Balkan Peninsula. In 1925, a Greek soldier was killed by Bulgarian forces after chasing a stray dog into Bulgarian territory. This incident sparked a full-scale war between Greece and Bulgaria. The conflict, known as the War of the Stray Dog, lasted only a few days, but it involved intense fighting, and numerous casualties occurred on both sides. Eventually, both nations called for a ceasefire, and the League of Nations mediated the end of the conflict. The war remains a bizarre example of how a single stray animal could ignite an international conflict. 16. The War of the Sandwich Islands, 1825. United States versus Great Britain, Pacific Ocean. The War of the Sandwich Islands, also known as the Hawaiian Incident, was sparked by an argument over who should control the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii. British and American naval forces had competing interests in the Pacific, and tensions rose over trade and territorial control. The conflict was limited to a series of skirmishes, with both sides attempting to claim authority over the Hawaiian Islands. In the end, both powers withdrew, and the islands remained independent for the time being, though it led to long-term political repercussions. 17. The Battle of Cowes, 1931. Italy versus Ethiopia, Horn of Africa. The Battle of Cowes is one of the most bizarre minor conflicts of the 20th century. It started when Ethiopian herders accused Italian forces of stealing their cattle. The confrontation quickly escalated into a military clash, despite the issue being relatively small in scope. The battle was a minor skirmish, and while both sides suffered casualties, the outcome had no significant impact on the broader context of Italy's imperial ambitions in Africa. 18. The War of the Roses, 1455 to 1487. House of Lancaster versus House of York, England. The War of the Roses, although a major conflict in English history, had one of the most unusual names. The two warring factions, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, fought for control of the English throne. The war was named after the rose emblems of the two houses, red for Lancaster and white for York. The conflict lasted over 30 years and involved multiple battles, betrayals, and shifting allegiances. Despite its major political consequences, the name War of the Roses adds an odd touch to its legacy. 19. The Duck War, 1840. United States versus Canada, British, North America. The Duck War began after tensions rose over hunting rights in the border region between the U.S. and British North America, now Canada. American hunters, crossing into Canadian territory, were accused of poaching ducks on British lands. A series of retaliatory raids and skirmishes followed, with both sides accusing each other of violating territorial rights. The war lasted for several months, but resulted in no major conflicts or casualties, and it ended peacefully with a diplomatic agreement over hunting rights. 20. The War of the Kettle, 1544. France versus England, Europe. The War of the Kettle, although obscure, involved a dispute over a cooking kettle. The conflict started when an English nobleman, while on a visit to France, was insulted when a French lord borrowed his prized kettle without permission. The Englishman demanded its return, and when the kettle was not returned promptly, a diplomatic conflict escalated. Though there were no major battles, the event led to a series of diplomatic insults and small military skirmishes between the two nations. Thanks for watching Warfare Codex. If you enjoyed this journey into history's strangest figures, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more amazing stories. See you in the next one.